My name is Ray Aldred. I was born in northern Alberta in Grand Prairie, Alberta. I was born. Hey, there you go. Somebody else from Grand Prairie. And my mom was born on the banks of the Lesser Slave Lake, which is north of Edmonton, Alberta, near a little community called Fost, which is the territory of the Swan River Cree First Nations. And so I have treaty status from my grandfather, who was part of that. And my mom lived in a tent till she was 6. When my grandfather joined the Canadian Army, they stripped him of his treaty status. And they used to pay you $70 to give up the Gradual Civilization Act in Canada ran for several years, and they would pay you money if you signed off the treaty and became enfranchised, which was and then that meant you gave up your treaty status. And so then when that happened, they kicked them off. They're kicked off the reserve, kicked off your traditional territory. And you were supposed to become just part of the Canadian politic. And so that happened. So my mom, the positive thing that happened through that is that my mom didn't have to go to residential schools, because technically she wasn't First Nations anymore. Now in Canada, they changed that in the 1980s. Bill C-31 gave status back to a bunch of us, probably 300,000. And then if it gets royal assent, Bill C-2 will grant extension to other Indigenous people who lost their status because of Canadian / colonial kind of politics.
Do you have to pay the $70 back?
No. No, and if you show up on Treaty Day, you can get your $5. Because the treaty, I'm part of Treaty 8, which Treaty 8 extends from north of Edmonton, Alberta into Saskatchewan, 3 First Nation bands there, and all the way into BC, almost to Fort St. John, and then up almost to Yellowknife. That's Treaty 8, signed in 1899. And if you show up on Treaty Day, you get $5. And they used to do Treaty Days. Some of them, there would be an RCMP officer in their red serge, and then the official from Indian Affairs, and you sign your name and you get your $5 bill. And that's the money. So anytime you hear First Nations get all this money, it's true, we get $5 a year. If you have a treaty. If you don't have a treaty, you don't get the $5. So BC doesn't have treaty. So, and I came into the whole journey to seek reconciliation. So, I mean, I was born. If you're born First Nations, then you're right away having to work on reconciliation, because you have this identity in you that's like when I was growing up. So I'm 66, so my age and maybe a little younger, but my age and older, we all had to deal with that. Indigenous people, there was a denigrated, the history in Canada is that First Nations were a problem to be solved. That's how, anytime we were in the news, it was always because we'd done something or taken something or got something back, and it was a problem, and somehow it had to be solved. So if you look at a whole group of people like that, then if you're a kid growing up, then somehow you want to hide that. So then Lots of us did. So we tried to hide who we were. And we would try to claim we were something else, which were legitimate. There were all these legitimate things you could be in Canada. You could be a Canadian, although when I was growing up, no one said they were Canadian. You know, could root for the Canadians, you know. And, but in those days, people were like, they were French or they were English. So you sort of adhered to one of those things. And you said you weren't Indigenous. So then there was this reconciliation meant trying to make peace with your own identity. But politically, for good or for bad, you know, there were other things going on, like in the Anglican Church, like back in 1950s, William Winter, who was an archdeacon in Ontario, he was calling for self-determination and the right for Indigenous people to have their own bishops. Like that was in the 1950s. 1969, the Henry Report, Henry was a United Church minister, and the Anglican Church, I don't know, they probably paid him, I don't know, to do a report of the Indigenous ministry of the Anglican Church. And his report became a book called Beyond Traplines. And in it, it said that the Anglican Church needed to treat Indigenous people as adults instead of as children, as wards of the government, which kind of followed what the Canadian government had done. When it comes to the Anglican Church or any of the mainline churches, or I don't know, any of the churches maybe in Canada, if you wanted to figure out what churches were going to do to First Nations, you just had to watch what the government did, and the church would just follow, by and large. And so reconciliation was needed. 1969, 1970s, the Canadian government, or the Indigenous people, begin to take the Canadian government to court. The Calder decision in British Columbia really switched things up because, you know, prior to 1960, First Nations weren't allowed to raise money to take the Canadian government to court. That all changed with the Calder decision, and that came off the books, and so First Nations began to take the Canadian government and Canadian. Whenever they say Canadian, that's people. They began to take the Canadian people to court. And there was a thing called the Indian Ecumenical Conference that happened on Morley Reserve outside of Calgary, Alberta. Started in 1970, ran until 1984. In it, the traditional people, the Indigenous people, asked that the church make room or acknowledge that Indigenous spirituality had something to offer and to make room. Those things were all going on. And in the 1970s, survivors of the residential schools began to file court, take the government and the church to court. And by the time 1990, I'll jump ahead to 1990 because I got lost in a haze. I'm an old hippie, so there was a haze there. But somewhere around 1979, things started to get clearer. And I had a powerful experience with Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and stopped drinking and quit using drugs and decided to go into ministry. But not wanting to be presumptuous, it took me 9 years to decide if this was really God and not just my own. Because we addicts are megalomaniacs. We have these delusions of grandeur. And so I just wanted to wait to see. And so finally we go off to study, and then because I moved to Regina, Saskatchewan from Grand Prairie, Alberta. And Regina, Saskatchewan is where I experienced racism that I knew was racism. When you grow up someplace, you're experiencing racism as a kid, but you think maybe that's just the way things are. But when I went to Regina, Saskatchewan, there was no, people made no, you knew that they didn't like you. And it was just obvious. And then I started meeting Indigenous people who had went through residential school, and it was bad. It was bad. They were older than me, maybe 6, 7 years older than me. I remember one person, and he said, everything you heard bad, that happened to me, everything. And it was complicated. It was complicated. And while I'm studying for ministry, the crisis at Ganasatagi happened, or Oka. But it was really a crisis for Ganasatagi more than it was for Oka. Oka wanted to build a golf course, or they wanted to enlarge their golf course to 18 holes. I don't know if you remember. Well, that would have put a fairway right past the cemetery for Ganasatagi. And they didn't want, somebody, chipping on from grandma's grave. So they said, well, we really don't want this happen. And it snowballed into this huge crisis, since maybe some of you remember 1990, that the Canadian Armed Forces were called out and they surrounded Ganasatagi, and suddenly Canada wanted reconciliation. So they called for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which was Canada's first attempt to have some reconciliation. And there's 4,000 pages and a whole bunch of recommendations. But you know what happens with government recommendations. Same thing that happens with synod recommendations. Right? Someone says, oh yeah, we have a recommendation on that, and then that's it. And to some, like the city of Calgary actually took some of those and tried to apply them. There were governments, usually on the municipal level, and probably some churches that did try to do some things. But even prior to the Oka crisis, there were the beginnings of apologies, if you remember. The United Church apology. But the First Nations said, well, we hear your apology and we receive it, but we don't accept it. Because we don't see any change in how you act. And there were Anglicans, there were some apologies that happened. There was a growing movement, though, among First Nations for a call to reconciliation and a call for truth and reconciliation that was growing. Phil Fontaine was kind of one of the main voices in those days. Phil was from Manitoba, I think. He was the Grand Chief of the AFN in those days. And I met him in the Vancouver airport one time. His brother or cousin was a Catholic priest, which I think he got to meet the Pope. So Phil wanted reconciliation, but he wanted some kind of discussion to happen, something to happen for the survivors. The survivors. So that's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sort of flowed out of those things. And then and Canada too had apologies. There was a statement on reconciliation, 1998. 1998, Jane Stewart, who was the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs, made a statement on reconciliation, which in effect said, we're sorry that it happened. We feel bad. But even in those days, even the first United Church apology, if I remember correctly, they wanted to couch things so that they weren't actually admitting any wrong. Because there was a big concern in the church that if you apologized, then you'd have to make amends. We'd much rather apologize and not make amends, if that makes any sense. But that's kind of how, and I was in some discussion with the denomination that I was part of, and I remember they'd always show up. It would always be a denominational official and a lawyer, and they would come to talk. The other thing that got reconciliation going was so there was the Oka crisis, and then there was triggered the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, and then in the September of 1995, Dudley George was killed at Ipperwash. Shot, he was unarmed, he was shot by the OPP. And Mike Harris, who was premier, had told the OPP, get those people out of there. Which he later denied that he said that. But so then Dudley George is called. In response to that, Elijah Harper, who's from Red Sucker Lake. Elijah Harper is the same Elijah Harper who scuttled the Meech Lake Accord for Brian Mulrooney's government because he voted no in the Manitoba legislature. It's interesting, the Manitoba legislators, the ones that are always speaking up for what's right. You know, Danielle Smith wants to leave Canada and join the United States. Only she doesn't say that, but that's really what they want to do. And yet it takes Wab Kinew to say, well, you're incorrect. That's not how that goes. So I always find that fascinating. But Elijah Harper called for a spiritual gathering, the Sacred Assembly, 1995 in December. And I thought it was kind of cool because, you know, the Huron Carol says it was in the moon of wintertime. And I was walking across that bridge to get from Ottawa to Gatineau, and I was thinking about that song. It was in the moon of wintertime, right? So we were... I was thinking about In the Moon of Wintertime again when I was in Hazelton. No, Gitsigukla, if you know where that is. Meeting Ray Jones and I were there. Ray Jones and Aldred. We were driving around the community, and I said, "Hey, we were looking at the Christmas lights." So we said, "Remember Huron Carol?" Yeah. And you remember, what's his name? He used to be on north of 60. What was his name? And he used to do those concerts. What was his name again?
Tom Jackson.
Tom Jackson. And I said to Ray Jones, well, at least Tom Jackson's still an Indian. Carrie gets it. Right? Because Buffy can't say that anymore. Joseph Boyd. Anyways, I digress. Yeah. Elijah Harper, he calls for, and he said, we need to gather to come up with a spiritual solution to address the racial enmity that exists in Canada. That's what he called. And it fascinates me. I went to Northern Ireland, South Africa, and New Zealand in 2023 for my sabbatical. And what fascinated me, it's always the people who suffered the most who call for reconciliation. Always. And so Elijah Harper called for a sacred assembly, and so there's a couple thousand of us that showed up, and different people made cameo appearances, like I remember seeing Jean Chrétien, Lucien Bouchard, and others to talk about what would it take. And there was a statement about reconciliation that came out, 1995. And then, like I said, 1998, there was a statement about reconciliation. And then eventually, Stephen Harper offers an apology. In all those things, the danger when you're doing these things is that you're making an apology to try to placate people. And you're hoping that this will actually stop people talking. If we just do something and then it'll stop talking. But that's not how apology should work. Apology should begin a conversation. So then, 2008, they made an apology. And then shortly after that, the commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began. And then there was several public meetings, each meeting based on one of the 7 sacred teachings, each one of those. Because that's our law. If you think about it, that's Indigenous law, the 7 sacred teachings. And they tell us what kind of a human beings we need to be in order to be people who live out the harmony that we see that the Creator has put into everything all around us. Because that's what we're called to do. Reconciliation we see in Jesus Christ, who brings Creator and creation into perfect harmony, which is God's intention for all of creation, that Creator and creation would be in perfect harmony. And we see that in Jesus Christ, and we're supposed to be the kind of human beings who live that out. That reconciliation is much about embracing God's creative work that is all around us, to be who we were created to be and draw forth what is best from the earth. So then people like Elijah Harper and others, that's what they were doing. They were calling for reconciliation, calling for some kind of spiritual solution. It fascinates me that it's always the people who have suffered the most. To achieve reconciliation, we are in debt to the victims of violence. And we rely on their ability to be with us and ask us to change. And they have the right to ask us because they are setting aside any hope for justice that will see every one of the perpetrators caught and made to deal with their crimes. The only way forward for Canada is to continue to listen to our elders, to listen to the truth, and to call from those who have suffered and the call from those who have suffered and are surviving to seek reconciliation, to seek the truth, but in the end to embrace reconciliation and try to live together as neighbors by coming up with a shared plan to heal the damage. That's what we were trying to do. That's what we were trying to do. And the way that you achieve, the way that you work at reconciliation is, I remember listening to Pierre Allard, who was those of you who've heard me speak, I always refer to these, so you've heard this story again, you can check out. I'll get to something that you'll be interested in a minute, but Pierre Allard was the head of Corrections Canada, the chaplains. And I heard him speak in the late 1990s, and he said that restorative justice is, like it's from Psalm 85, when peace and justice kiss. When righteousness and justice kiss. Psalm 85. You're seeking shalom. You're seeking justice. And in 1998, he said, like in Canada, there's this missing jewel of justice. We're missing it, and he said, First Nations are the only ones who seem aware that it's missing. And he said, what we need is restorative justice. Restorative justice, 3 movements. Number 1, you got to tell the truth. You got to tell the truth. It's got to be complete disclosure. Number 2, you have to listen. And you got to listen in a way that allows you to feel with your heart. And you have to come up with a shared plan. And that's where we're at in Canada right now. And that's where we're at in the Anglican Church, trying to come up with a shared plan with fits and starts. But it's not easy. And it's not always going well. And it's not going great right now, I'll be honest, in the Anglican or the United Church. Everybody's trying hard, but they're kind of losing momentum. And they're wondering, what do we got to do? What do we got to do? And there's always a tendency, especially for guys who are old like me, to just try to do everything they've always done. And we think if we just do more of what we've always done, we'll get someplace. But I think someone said something about a definition of insanity. It's just doing more of what we've always done and hope it'll be different. So you got to tell the truth. So the whole thing about the whole thing about telling the truth is that was what was happening with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It came about because victims of different Indigenous policies came forward to talk about how it had impacted them. In effect, Canada did, like, there's 5 lies, 5 things that adults say to children that damage them. 5 kinds of things. Number 1, you're not good. Number 2, you're not competent. Number 3, you don't belong. Number 4, you are unlovable. And number 5, you shouldn't exist. And Canada said that to Indigenous people. Now, it didn't matter if it was in the residential school. Even if you didn't go to the residential school, you still heard those things. And if you think about it, anybody who lives in a marginalized group, they hear those kinds of things all the time. All the time. And it doesn't change unless you can talk about it. It doesn't go away if you just stop talking about it. It doesn't go away. It's there. So you got to find a place where you can talk about what happened. Trauma workshops are where you can, or a support group for people who've suffered abuses where you could talk about what's going on. It flows out of 12-step groups too, that you can talk about what's going on. You need to create spaces where that can happen, but you got to tell the truth. You got to tell the truth. If you don't tell the truth, nothing changes. Nothing changes. Telling the truth does not mean manufacturing consent. It doesn't mean that you spin things. In fact, you got to begin to be brutally honest about what's going on. And you can't tell half-truths either. You got to tell the truth. These are all the things institutions do to try to. We're prone to them. It's like we don't even got to think about it, we just do them. I've been in leadership long enough that I'm tempted to do it too, to spin the truth. My wife sometimes says to me, "Why do you always try to make everybody feel better? Why don't you just say what's the problem?" Because the offering's not as big. No, I don't say that. Although I was speaking at a conference once and someone came after me and they said, "I feel so bad. What should I do?" And I said, "I could take an offering." I'm a terrible guy. And that's, yeah. So Canadian churches began to tell the truth. So that was the apologies. That's the beginning of telling the truth. When that happens, you think about it in your own relationship with your partner, or with anybody you're close to. When you apologize, you want to hear how this impacted them, don't you? You really don't want them just to say, "Yeah, okay, fine." Maybe when I was young, that's what I wanted. So you can still listen to the testimonies of the survivors. You can go on websites. The library, the Indian Residential School Library at UBC, all of their materials online. You can listen to the stories of some of the survivors. And you need to. That's the part of it. You got to tell the truth, and then you got to listen. You got to listen. And you got to listen with your heart. And it's not enough just to say, to repeat what the person said. Like sometimes Elaine will say to me, "Are you listening?" And I will just repeat verbatim what she said. But that's not what she meant.
Elaine's your wife.
Yeah, Elaine's my wife, yes. Elaine and I met when we were 14. She came over to we were moved into this little village called Wembley, Alberta. Little village was mostly Irish and Scottish settlers. And she was related to most of the village. And we moved there, and she came over, and I remember it was September, October And she said to my younger brother, tell your brothers to come out, we want to look at them. And then Elaine, I came out and I looked at Elaine, and God said, that's the woman you're going to marry. And I was terrified. And eventually we were married. But you got to listen, and my wife's taught me how to do that. But we went and took some training. It was called Survivors of Abuse Leadership Training Seminar. And it was to try to help us learn how to listen to people so that they could begin to talk about what happened and begin to feel again. Because how you cope with trauma, how you cope with hard things is you just learn to shut everything off. Like when you're going through trauma, a legitimate coping mechanism is to numb out, to disassociate. That's legitimate when you're going through something really severe. But for many Indigenous people, it became the way that we live our life. But you got to listen to someone tell their story, and you got to get good at listening, otherwise you just shut them off. So you got to listen. And the reason that you have to listen is because when a trust or a boundary has been violated between two groups, the person who's the one who violated the boundary has to listen to how much hurt they caused. And they have to listen in a way that they actually feel. Because if you don't feel, you will not change. It actually takes emotional resources and energy to change. And in Canada, the survivors were hoping that Canadians would listen to the pain that it had caused, so that they would have the emotional energy, Canadians would have the emotional energy to actually change. Because if you don't feel the legitimate shame for what happened, then you won't have enough energy to actually change anything. And as a man, I had to learn that, because I'm the guy who wants to just say I'm sorry and then forget about it. Look, I said I was sorry. Let's just move on. Life does not work like that. So you got to listen. You got to listen.
Sir,
Yes.
I also would like to say, if you're not allowed to talk, if you're not allowed to question, you do not. And for all those years I worked with our peoples, that was the lesson most that I had to teach. It's all right to question.
Good.
You can ask questions.
Yep.
It's good for you if you do.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And then we had to come up with a shared plan. I mean, a lot of what we do is we help people see that, because abuse and what happened in Canada turns everything around. And it often happens in racial kind of things, and is the people who are being discriminated against, they're the ones who end up feeling ashamed. And the people who cause this, they don't feel any shame. And everything gets turned around. Everything gets turned around. So, if you can listen with your heart, and then maybe begin to change, develop the emotional energy to actually begin to do something. So some of the things that we did was, we first met, there was a bunch of us that met, there was 35 First Nations. World Vision and Evangelical Fellowship of Canada sponsored a gathering of about 35 of us. Indigenous, mostly Indigenous, but some non-Indigenous people. And at this conference, we just committed, we heard one another's heart, and we committed to be agents of reconciliation. So out of that, things that happened was, there was a corporal, he was, I think his name was LeMay Domes. He was killed at Oka, shot and killed. He was a Quebec Sûreté officer. He was killed. Mavis Etienne, who was one of the Mohawk who were trying to negotiate a peace deal, she began to do prayer walks. And they joined with the church in Oka, and they would do prayer walks. And that culminated in this reconciliation gathering where the sister of Domes, this killed officer, and the Mohawks, they forgave one another and began to work together towards reconciliation. But they talked about what happened. They told the truth. They talked about how they felt, and they came together to begin to move forward. We tried to do that in the Christian Missionary Alliance in 2000. We met and talked about the things that had happened as First Nations churches in a denomination that was not First Nations. And we shared our story, and at one point we just said, we admitted, or the denomination admitted that the Canadian attitude towards First Nations people had impacted how they had treated us. And then we met and we began to work together. There were still problems. We were at least more honest with one another. And then those things happened in the Anglican Church. But you're trying to create space. What you're trying to do is you're trying to create this courageous space where people can, as our sister there said, can ask questions and begin to talk and begin to feel and begin to work towards a shared plan. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the 94 calls to action, they define reconciliation as the process to develop and nurture a mutual beneficial relationship between peoples in Canada. To develop, and there's need to develop a shared story, to develop the shared narrative. And this is where I think treaty comes in. Now, this is a problem in BC. Because the history in BC is that BC has resisted making treaty with their First Nations. Because, I don't know, there's a lot of history, but I think John A. Macdonald really wanted British Columbia to join Confederation. And so he sort of said well, oh, yeah, but you don't have to worry about that treaty thing. And so BC joins, and then they resist. They have resisted making treaty. The Niska came all the way down to meet with the provincial government, and the provincial government wouldn't even let them in the building because they had heard about the Royal Proclamation. Does that bell mean something? The Royal Proclamation said that in Canada, to be on the territory of First Nations, you had to negotiate. It had to be negotiated with the First Peoples whose territory this really was. No one had a right to take it or buy it except through negotiation with the Crown. And BC resisted that. And they continued, and there's all kinds of false statements. So part of reconciliation in BC is you got to learn what the history really was. The reason that we say we're on unceded territory is because it never came into treaty. And, no, it's okay. And so that's why that Cowichan thing freaks everybody out. So at St. Anne's, November 7th, after the morning service, I'm going to do a little presentation about that if you're interested.
What date was that?
June 7th. June 7th. So a week from Sunday, after the service. Yeah, St. Anne's, Richmond. I think technically it's St. Anne Steveston. But so learn about the historic Indigenous treaty process was, you see, because the treaties, which becomes the Royal Proclamation, but Canada made Indigenous treaty. They signed Indigenous treaties. It's not like Canadians, like England and France, knew about treaties coming from Europe, but they signed Indigenous treaties. Indigenous treaties are always seeking at least 4 things. Number 1, a peaceful existence. When Indigenous people see that our borders are close to one another, they immediately go spend more money on self-defense. No, they don't do that. They make treaty. They meet with the other group, and treaty is actually an attempt to become relatives. The way that you deal with enmity in an Indigenous context is you become the person in the room with the best manners and the most generous person in the room. If you want to be agents of reconciliation, you need to be the person in the room with the best manners and who's the most generous. And that's how First Nations deal with problems. To heal the land, like in Treaty 4, to heal the land, they make treaty. They become relatives. That's what they do. And so it's about seeking a peaceful existence. Indigenous treaty was also about access to the land. We gave the newcomers access to the land. The depth of a plow. That was what many Indigenous groups on the prairies believed, that we were in essence renting to the newcomers, and they could use to the depth of a plow. But access to the land means more than just private property. Private property is a concern that comes out of the European, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. When it comes to First Nations, we understand that people need to have places that they can be and be in relationship with. But it was never so much about private property. It was about being able to live in acts, to have communion with the land so that when you stand on it, you could feel it welcome you home. Right? If any of you traveled, when you come home, when you get off the plane, doesn't it feel good to be back in Canada, the land we call Canada? And if you were born here, you can feel it welcome you. Indigenous people recognize that. That's why they made treaty. And the third thing is that everyone should to be able to feed off the bounty of Mother Earth. Or the Haudenosaunee say, we all eat from the common bowl. That's why food security is an issue of reconciliation. Healing the land is an issue of reconciliation. And the fourth thing about Indigenous treaty is that we are not about forcing our way on another group, but to live in harmony with one another, to collaborate, to be so that you can be who the Creator made you to be. And there's just so many different things that fit into reconciliation and require us to continue to help press the government, because the government lacks political will to do anything except to have more meetings and no, I'm kidding. Actually, the first time I was in Ottawa, they said, we define success here by having another meeting. So if you get a commitment to have another meeting when you're in Ottawa, then you're successful. And no, they define success as getting reelected. That's why they need us to push them. Stephen Harper said 3 years before his apology in the House of Commons. Well, it wasn't just his apology. All the parties, all the opposition, each person made a statement. And but Stephen Harper said he wouldn't do it, And it was only because churches and people pushed them. Just like the missing and murdered women, the unmarked graves. Unless we push, it will not happen. And if we push, it will happen. It will happen. Because politicians can't help themselves. They bend to people who push them to do the right thing. In the Anglican Church, we need to continue to support self-determination. See, I'm getting to, yes? Yes. So one of the things that we have developed at the Vancouver School of Theology is the teaching house that moves around. And what we go is we go into a community and we ask them, what would be most helpful for you? How can we support what you're trying to do? And they tell us, and then we go deliver a 3 to 4 day, sometimes a 5-day training session on exactly what they've asked us to do. And then we check back in with them maybe a few weeks later and say, how's it going? What else can we come alongside of you? Well, in the area of self-determination, I mentioned William Winter. Well, the William Winter School of Ministry runs in Northern Ontario in July and in February. And they're training their own people to be clergy, Bishop Lydia Mamakwe. And we've partnered with them. Vancouver School of Theology is partnering with them. So we are going to send a professor, because they asked me to come and teach, so I taught on John, from scripture to sermon. And then they wanted someone to teach on Hebrew Bible. So we're going to send a professor out there in July for a week to teach on Hebrew Bible. We're going to try to come up with a 8-course diploma that meets what they think they need to ordain their people. And we're going to partner with them. Because Indigenous clergy in the Anglican Church do not get paid. They are non-stipendiary. So they can't do all the things that everyone who's getting paid can do. Because they can't afford it. So we're partnering with them. And if you want to join us, then all you got to do is donate to Vancouver School of Theology and just indicate Indigenous Studies program, and we will continue to do that. We also partner with the Henry Budd College in the Pas, Manitoba. Henry Budd was the first priest in the Western Anglican Church, I believe. Native priest. And we also continue to run our summer school. And we need help. A shared plan. Bishop Lydia Mamakwe is in Northern Ontario. The spiritual ministry of Mamamakwish. And we need help. So we're partnering with them. And I think as we do that, we heal the wounds of the past. And people see that those, people can kind of make, the Anglican Church gets a little more cred. We begin to see things that we're healing things, that we're moving through that. I'm proud of Canada, that when I go to other countries, I say, well, I was in the Philippines, and I said, in Canada, the churches got together and they put pressure on the government to apologize, and they did. And then they did a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in Davao City, where I was, meeting with these people, they thought that was a wonderful thing, if that could happen. And I was in Australia, in South Australia, and I was talking with some tribal leaders there, And they thought if the church would get behind their efforts that they were having to try to force or push forward for self-determination for their people in their country, if they thought the church could get on side, they thought that would be wonderful. But that had not been their experience. But I think that we are beginning to change. But we can't lose hope. And we can't think that it's just one-time thing. But it's a way of life. Oh, yeah. And if you want, I wrote a book called Our Home and Treaty Land. I was riffing off of the Canadian national anthem. You know that part where it says, our home on native land? No, that's not what they say. So I said, our home and treaty land. And you can look at it out there. If you would like a copy, I got some copies on order, but you could pre-order a copy.